Good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this first UNDP Harvard Kennedy School online dialogue. Our deep appreciation to the Center for International Development and the Harvard Kennedy School for the interest and support in preparing this dialogue. As you all know, in 1990, the first Human Development Report introduced a new approach for advancing human well-being. This UNDP Harvard dialogue is part of the outreach efforts of the 2020 Human Development Report. Today, we have a dual responsibility to provide insights for the long-term development policies, acknowledging that many of our current development practices are not sustainable, and lead to the socioeconomic recovery from COVID-19, the most severe crisis in our lifetimes. These are already intertwined tasks. Policies are being designed to face the crisis, and massive additional financial resources are being deployed to be paid by future generations. The IMF estimates that around $10 trillion have been committed as part of emergency packages in just a few months. Change is inevitable. A key question is how to make this crisis an opportunity for positive change. This session will focus on this, exploring how to use the current crisis as an opportunity to reconsider a path leading to more egalitarian, sustainable growth incorporating environmental considerations. I welcome the UNDP team led by Achim Steiner, our administrator. I welcome the Harvard scholars that have joined us on this conversation today. And last but not least, I welcome the students, the faculty, and the UN staff for having joined us today. Achim, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Good afternoon, Asim, dear colleagues, and hello to everybody who is following us online. This is a very exciting moment for us because we have sought and are continuously seeking to reach out to the world of academia and research and science in order to better connect that front line of practice, and particularly at a moment of COVID-19, where so much of what is happening right now seemed almost inconceivable just 5 months ago. Trying to bring the world of observing and monitoring and acting and responding to the crisis out there with a more structured, systematic understanding, appreciation, and in-time research in how we can respond better is fundamental to virtually every country and community across the world. The original idea of coming together, and Asim, thank you very much as Director of the Center for International Development of the Harvard Kennedy School, we were particularly keen to begin a dialogue series with you that would also be part of the discussions that lead up to the publication of the next Human Development Report, the HDR 2020, that UNDP will publish at the end of this year. At the heart of this report stands another crossroads in thinking about the future of development. The tradition of human development and of the Human Development Index and the way that we have defined it over decades has been very anthropocentric. It has focused on humans. It has used the traditional indicators of capabilities of human well-being and obviously broadened it beyond the narrow economic definition. But clearly in the 21st century, the planetary dimension to human well-being and therefore human development becomes ever more fundamental. It defines in many ways the outcomes that we can achieve through development choices and decisions we make. Pedro Conceição, who leads our Human Development Report Office, will also be part of the discussion this afternoon. And I'm particularly grateful that we can have this discussion right now because we face a short-term emergency and crisis. It's called COVID-19, but it has a very long tail into the future, both in terms of impacts and consequences, but also, and I hope that will be the focus of our discussion this afternoon, of choices that can and will be made over the next months and years in the way that the trajectory for development will either shift and evolve from where we were heading before, or simply return back to a normal that we all know already was troubled. In that sense, I want to be very brief in my opening remarks and simply say to Asim and faculty members and my colleagues in UNDP and all of those of you who are connecting this afternoon, this is a conversation in which no one, I think, will claim to have an answer, but we often begin by having to ask the right questions. And then from there begin to envisage a global community learning about what needs to change. And that not building back better alone is what we're looking at, it is actually building forward better And both in the context of COVID-19, but also in the longer term enterprise of trying to define human development and comprehend the future of development and the choices that we can make that will ultimately define something that goes beyond trade-offs, beyond dichotomies, beyond some gaining and many others losing, setting the future against the present, the poor against the rich, the urban against the rural. Too often in development, we have framed these choices in terms of trade-offs. And as we know, in the political economy of development, that kind of setup usually allows those with control, power, and influence over economic assets to determine the nature of that trade-off. This is what is at the heart of our discussion, I hope, today as we look forward. And with that, I hand over to Professor Kwacha Asim, over to you. And thank you very much again for making this wonderful dialogue possible.
Great. Thanks so much, Hakeem. Thanks to Isabel, Pedro as well, and all the UN colleagues, and thanks to my own colleagues who are here today. You know, at the Center for International Development at Harvard, what we are really looking for is exactly the kind of events and collaborations that Hakeem alluded to. I think there is an excitement in the world of development, which is kind of the merging of research and practice. This year's Nobel is a testament to that. But this idea of sort of working with leading practitioners, doing research, which is really not just addressing the frontiers of scholarship, but also really having an impact on the lives of people that we care about. I think this is really exciting, and Hakeem and I were talking earlier today. We're very much hoping this to be the beginnings of a series of collaborative events we can do together and collaborations that we can get in together so that we can both kind of fulfill what we think is our mission, which is really impacting the lives of people in some of the toughest and most challenging places and at some of the most challenging times that we face as a world community. You know, there is a lot of success we've had collectively in the field of development, and the UN itself has been spearheading a lot of the success. COVID has probably highlighted some of the tensions, some of the fractures, some of our shortcomings, some of the things that need to be done in a way that I think is both a very sobering thought for us, but perhaps also a call to action. And at least the way I think we are thinking of this circumstance is that there is a lot of opportunity. While there is tragedy, you know, I think in the face of tragedy, I'm glad to see, and I'm really thrilled to see my own colleagues who've kind of risen to this call to action in the research that they're doing and the work that they're doing and the teaching that they're doing in ways that we can potentially give back. And as Hakeem alluded to, this is not, unfortunately, a short event. It's not even an event where once the vaccine gets discovered, which I'm really hopeful, I'm looking towards my public health colleagues over there, no pressure guys, but I'm really hopeful that will happen. But even after that, it's going to take a long time for us to figure out how to rebuild, to reestablish. But I'm also hoping to reimagine. There are certain chinks in the armor of how we do things. Those chinks in academia can be chinks that disciplines have, walls we create between ourselves. I think COVID has made us realize that collaborating across disciplines is going to be critical, and that's beginning to happen. But also collaborating with the world of practice is going to be fundamental. And so with that, sort of, I welcome this event. Again, I'm very thankful to my colleagues who've joined. We have a very rich span of discussions. There's a lot of focus on the environment. I think the reasons are going to be pretty obvious. And there are many other topics that we would have liked to cover, but we can't in this event, as even though we have a 2 hour slot. But I'm hoping you'll get a glimpse of some of the excitement, some of the potential, and also a sense of what may come next and kind of the areas that we're hoping to be working towards. So with that, I'm grateful, I'm excited. I think I'm going to, my duty to turn back again to you, Isabel, or is that? But otherwise, welcome everyone, and look forward to a fun discussion.
Thank you so much, Asim, for those opening remarks. Thank you, Hakeem, for leading us into this conversation. Also joining us today for this conversation from different schools of Harvard, we have from the Kennedy School of Government, Professor Joseph Aldi, who's a professor of public policy, William Clark, a professor of international science, public policy, and human development, Isabel Guerrero, lecturer in public policy, Gordon Hanson, urban policy, Henry Lee, public policy. From the Harvard Graduate School of Design, we have Richard Pacer, professor of real estate development. From the Harvard Business School, we have Florent Reinhardt, professor of business administration. And a warm welcome as well to the UNDP participants, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, assistant administrator and regional director for Latin America and the Caribbean, Kani Wignayara, assistant administrator and director of the Regional Bureau of Asia and Pacific, Pedro Conseicao, Human Development Report Office lead, and a particular welcome to the students, faculty, public in general that have joined us for this conversation. In terms of housekeeping, before we go on to the more interesting part of the conversation, I would just like to extend to all the panelists once again that this is a conversation. We really value your interest in being part of this conversation. And we have organized the session into 2 blocks for the sake of having some structure. However, please feel free to participate in the conversation in different moments. This is your scenario. And to our audience, we will begin taking questions from you at the end of each block. However, feel free to post your questions already in the Q&A blog, and we will be choosing from those questions to ensure that we give a space to many people to participate. So thank you. And with that, I pass on to Joachim Steiner to moderate the first block.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And let me go straight into the depth of the discussion. We begin with a brief overview and presentation by Pedro Conseicao, who leads the Human Development Report Office within UNDP since 2019. He was already the architect of the 2019 Human Development Report that focused on inequality and in many ways was almost a prophetic report on much of what we have seen play out against the backdrop of the COVID-19 drama, where inequality has been exposed as perhaps one of the greatest variables determining on whether people become ill, whether they survive, whether they are protected, and whether their governments and their societies are able to respond. The 2020 theme is a fascinating one, and the task that Pedro has been given is to find the next generation of human development report indexing, and in that sense to bring the planetary and the human dimensions together. And Pedro, without any further delay, over to you for a quick introductory presentation.
Thank you so much, Achim. Thank you for calling it prophetic. I feel honored and inspired by that comment. Let me start with our thinking on the impact of COVID-19 on human development. It's an unprecedented shock on human development that is manifest in many different ways. But one of the things we tried to do was to assess the impact of the crisis by looking at Human Development Index. And it's unprecedented when we look at Human Development Index because it's hitting on the 3 dimensions of the index at the same time and in every country simultaneously. So we know the impact on health, which is obvious, the impact on income, on which we'll be speaking of, the impact on education. 9 out of every 10 kids are out of school. So if we look at what we call effective school enrollment rates, adjusted for the ability to connect to the internet and therefore continue to be in education, we are now seeing school enrollment rates that we have last seen in the mid-1980s. So this is a massive shock to human development that would bring the Human Development Index down for the first time since we started publishing it in 1990. And as you mentioned, Achim, this is a crisis that is overlaid on existing and in some cases growing inequalities in human development that we documented in the report last year. So one of the issues we looked at last year was related to gender inequality and the extent to which social norms that are supportive of progress toward gender equality were actually backsliding. So it might not be surprising to see the increase in domestic violence as a result of the crisis. We also spoke in the report last year of the new necessities of the 21st century, and we spoke of the importance of looking at internet access. And we mentioned that this was important because it would be something that would enable people in the future to participate more fully in societies, in the digital economies, and the risks of not having access to the internet could pose on those opportunities. So the crisis in a way brought the future to the present, and these risks are materializing now before our eyes. But finally, I should just say that we are only halfway through the year. We are also midway through the crisis, and a lot depends on the policies that we choose to undertake. And we argue that policies that focus on this issue of equity are fundamental. So just to give an example, if we were to make access to the internet more equitable, the drop in human development that we simulated would be cut by half. So this speaks to the importance of having policies that address inequalities in human development in many, many different dimensions. And then finally, perhaps the crisis is also an opportunity to think more deeply about the underlying drivers of the crisis. And there's an ongoing discussion. Scientists are arguing about the origin of the virus. Some say that it may have jumped from animals into humans. Whether this is the case or not for COVID-19 will be sorted out over the next few weeks. But we know for sure that the increase in the frequency of this type of diseases is related to pressures that we're putting on nature, land use changes, pressure on biodiversity. And so this speaks to the need to understand the pressures that we're putting on our planet, including climate change as another manifestation of this crisis, and understand how we can continue to expand human development, but doing it in a way that is in balance with the planet. And that is indeed a challenge that we'll be taking forward with the 2020 Human Development Report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And it is my honor now to moderate the next session. I think Asim said this morning he's very glad I'm doing it because I'm going to be this terrible person who is going to put this intellectual constraint around wonderful faculty who are meant to answer incredibly searching and far-reaching questions in a time window of 4 minutes. But the idea, dear colleagues, is that we do not answer them all, but we try and begin to sort a very complex landscape. So the question in this session is essentially a very broad one, but asking you to pick a few winners in terms of where you think the real changes might occur. In essence, it is, what are the game changers that are emerging during this crisis that might complicate or facilitate a transition to more sustainable future and fair societies, taking the equity, inequality, and sustainability variables as two domains, and asking you to perhaps pick a couple there that really represent the greatest need for focus. And I'm very happy to turn to Professor Joseph Alde, who is a professor of public policy and also has a very long history of addressing the regulatory role of the state in this rapidly evolving landscape. So to you, Joseph, Professor Alde, you have the floor, and 4 minutes. I hope you can manage to convince us that even in such a short period of time, important things can be said. Over to you.
Thank you, Achim. And thanks to you and Asim and everybody at both at Harvard and UNDP for this event. It's a pleasure to be here. I think about this as perhaps a few forks in the road that we're facing now. The first, I think, really important fork that we're going to face is a question about how we as peoples and as the governments representing the peoples, how we engage and work with each other. There's one route forward that I think is one of isolationism, one where there's greater concern about having to make sure supply chains are domestic because of some of the economic risks we've learned over the course of the COVID-19 crisis, where there may be even greater restrictions on the movement of peoples and on migration. I think the other fork in the road is the recognition that we face global risk. And as a result, we need to think about how we as a global community can work together and in tandem and become more effective and challenging in taking on these risks. And of course, a lot of the work I do focuses on the risk of climate change. And this is one that certainly those in the climate community have been considering is how do we take some of the lessons from COVID and think about how that will motivate action going forward. But I think this is a fork, and I'm not sure which way we're going forward on this, but I think that's one of the really critical decisions that are going to need to be made. I think a second big decision is about how we think about the distributional consequences of COVID-19, how we learn about the abilities of people to adapt when faced with these shocks and those who are not. And we've seen this, I think, both within countries, we see this within the United States, and we see this across countries as well. That some have the resources, they have the capacity, that when they suffer a truly unprecedented shock like this, they can adapt because they have the resources and the capacity. But there are some peoples, because of where they live and how they live, the jobs they're in, they're not able to adapt. They find themselves more exposed to those kinds of risk. I think this holds also important lessons when we think about how do we address that in the near term for COVID, but how does that inform how we go forward thinking about those who are most vulnerable to the risk, say, of a changing climate over the course of this century. I think the third fork that I think about in the context of sort of energy and climate change has to deal with transportation. We saw truly unprecedented drops in the consumption of oil, causing the price of oil globally to truly collapse. If anything, the challenge of the oil right now is finding places to store the oil that has already been pumped out of the ground. But I think there are important questions, as we've seen in the United States, a gradual sort of return to automobile usage. We're not seeing that in mass transit. When we think about the visions of a future that addresses climate change, there's a key part about how we think about changing mobility. And a key characteristic of that, whether it's in the context of mass transit, whether it's in the context of, say, shared rides, they're all raised questions about whether or not there will be a comfort. When we think about behavioral changes because of COVID, will people be comfortable going back to the bus, going back to the subway, sharing vehicles? When we think about a long-term technological future of autonomous vehicles and shared rides, will there be the demand there for that because of some of what are the perhaps behavioral changes coming out of this? Do we see an event like this, which is fantastic with all the people we've brought together here? Part of that's enabled by the fact that we didn't have to get on planes and go places. And we've certainly seen, I think, dramatic changes in aviation. The question is whether or not those persist going forward, or whether or not we take this as an opportunity to think about ways in which we move in a variety of dimensions that may affect in important ways what our impact on the climate going forward will be. Unfortunately, I think these are forks in the road. I don't know which way we're going on these, but I think where we go on each one of these will have important implications for both how we come out of COVID and how we then tackle the risks that we as the people of the planet face in the future.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and for staying within the time window. Remarkable forks in the road, choices to be made. I think immediately leading to Henry Lee, who is Senior Lecturer in Public Policy at Harvard, but also the Director of the Environment and Natural Resources Program within the Kennedy School, and with personal experience also in the execution of government as an actor, Director of Energy in Massachusetts, amongst many other things that you have done. Henry, if I may turn to you, the game changers in 4 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the organizers of this event. This is sort of an exhilarating time, but it's also, as Joe points out, it's a time in which we are confronting a lot of challenges, but there are some opportunities. I think, let me first touch on the challenges. I think coming out of this crisis, capital markets are going to be a lot tighter than they were before. I think many countries are facing looming debt problems. I think that the stimulus programs, I think that some of the developed countries may be able to have yet another stimulus, but I don't think a lot of the poorest countries in the world are going to be able to go down that road. And so many of the stimulus programs historically have emphasized shovel-ready projects, which not always are green projects. Green projects sometimes are more expensive, and sometimes they take longer to organize, and they get put to the side in a lot of stimulus programs in the past. I think poverty alleviation is going to be an enormous issue coming out of this crisis. And finally, there is the road that Joe referred to, but I think that this tension between going down a more nationalistic perspective and one that is more focused on cooperation, I think that is a big choice that countries have. I fear some days that we may choose the nationalism rather than the cooperation, and I think that would be a very large mistake. Let me touch very briefly on what I think are some opportunities. We've been focused a lot on climate change. It is a looming crisis. But in the middle of this, in the short term, 6.5 million people die a year from conventional air pollution. If you go to a person in the streets in New Delhi, they're not going to talk about climate change. They're going to talk about particulates and other toxic air pollutants. And most of those emanate, not all by any means, but a lot of them emanate from fossil fuel electric generating facilities. And I think a focus on conventional air pollution and its problems and could pay significant dividends. Second, climate change is something we say, well, it's going to sort of gradually move to a warmer climate. I don't think that's probably valid. If you look historically at the records, you're going to find that we tend to flip into new eras. I was just looking the other day, coming out of the Ice Age, in a 5-year period, we flipped 18 degrees. Look at what's going on in Siberia right now with the temperatures over 100 degrees. So I think that the locus of the damage function that's going to come out of a very rapid change in climate are going to be cities, and they're going to be coastal cities. And we need to have a program that addresses the needs of cities which are not fiscally as strong as the countries. In many cases, this problem will manifest itself not in an entire country, but in a number of locations within that country. And I think those will be primarily urban areas. And I think there needs to be a lot more attention paid to urban areas and helping the leaders and the mayors of those cities. My final point is on electricity. If we go to a climate, a less carbon intensive world, we're going to have to move to more of an electric world. And this is an opportunity with demand down to start making some of the reforms that are critical to be able to move in that direction. That means beginning to build a grid system that can handle intermittent energy sources from renewables. It means building a transmission system that can move power to places where there is no power right now. And finally, it's an opportunity to retire some of the older fossil fuel plants, but do so in a socially responsible way. And I think that's an opportunity that we should take advantage of. So there's quickly 3 things. I think conventional air pollution, number 1, focusing on urban areas, number 2, and number 3, an opportunity to have significant electricity reform that can build up a system that can integrate renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. And from the forks in the roads to some very specific, let's say, sectoral or policy issues that, that could define very clear choices that can be made both against the backdrop of a crisis, but also looking forward. Let me turn to Isabel Guerrero-Pulgar, who is the adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and also the co-founder and executive director of Imago. Both an economist with a lot of experience in public policy, but I was also struck, Isabel, by your background that you studied psychoanalysis, and perhaps the combination of the two will serve us very well in moments of crisis when perception and reality are not always aligned, and we need to look beyond the reflexes. So over to you for the 4 minutes and the game changers. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So I think we have seen a moment that is really calling for transformation, just like in the climate change, in terms of development as well. It's a series of shocks. We've seen so many. I feel sometimes we're in 1918, then 1929, 1945, 1968. A lot is happening right now. And what we have seen is that in the immediate response to COVID, many countries have gone into lockdown, some more dramatically than others, like India. And the government couldn't really reach to the communities. There was a huge gap with people even having problems in terms of hunger. And we saw how social enterprises and communities stepped up and went into these gaps. And so for me, the lesson is we have seen how social enterprises, local enterprises can be more nimble, have a lot of trust in the community, are quick to adapt, they have huge networks, and I think they have shown that they could become a new development tool. I think the public policies to promote that are clear in terms of what needs to happen for them to really succeed and thrive. We can talk about that in terms of, the definition of a social enterprise, labor laws, visas, taxes. There are many, many tools that could be used in public policy. But I want to give 3 examples that bring this home. The first one is in India, where the value chain in terms of the food delivery was completely broken. So there was no food, and farmers, on the other hand, had huge amount of products that they could not deliver. So Rudy, a social enterprise owned by SEWA, which is an organization owned by 2 million women, Rudy found a way to procure in mass from those marginal farmers and then pack this and go to the village, thereby is taking the opportunity which before was taken by 13 levels of intermediaries between the market and the farmer to go in and have women at the grassroots benefit from this. A second example in Pakistan, an organization called Connect to Hear. They were able to help deaf individuals by immediately translating and having videos of all the COVID directives that the government was given, and they did it at a national level. And the third one in Kenya, Shofco, which actually gave access to 250,000 people with hand washing stations, soap, and disinfectant. Because when you think about washing your hands was such a crucial part of the way to deal with COVID, but many of these slums didn't have access to safe water. So for me, it's been an opportunity that has showed, yes, the crack in the system, but it's also shown the innovation that was going on at the base of the pyramid with very nimble organizational innovations like these ones that we should look for policies to develop for the future.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And having lived through the pandemic here in New York since January, February, this is not a phenomenon that we only find in so-called developing countries. In fact, right here in New York City, it was the communities, it was the neighborhood, it was the street, it was the neighbor, but also local government institutions that stepped in and I think demonstrated that not only is there solidarity that one can tap on, but enormous capacity. And it is something that we have taken very seriously in UNDP when we launched 60 accelerator labs, precisely to try and refocus our attention on sense making, on solutions mapping that picks up on that capacity that is nascent within every community and society. And in moments of crisis, we suddenly discover it. So thank you for drawing our attention to that. Let me now turn to Richard Peiser, the Michael D. Spear Professor of Real Estate Development at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Richard, over to you, and thank you very much for joining us.
It's a real pleasure for me to take part of this. I confess, though I have personal interests in Asia and Africa, most of my thinking on the issues for today are within the U.S. context. First, going back to a comment I think that Henry made, I do fear for what's going to happen at the global level. I think there's going to be an increase in immigration from the poorer countries to the wealthy that is going to increase racism and anti-immigration policies, and I do fear that it's going to lead to a rise of the far right and lead to a rise for the greater nationalism, and this also hurts foreign investment and especially third world countries. But looking on the brighter side, there are well, when I think about new opportunities for innovation and sustainable planning, especially within the U.S. context, we have structural issues, governance issues, climate change issues, and technology issues. With structural problems, the biggest one I see is the dependence on the private sector to build and private capital to provide the money, especially for projects that are needed for social benefit, and in particular, the worldwide low-income housing shortage. In the area of governance in the U.S., but also many other countries, the power is devolved to the local jurisdictions who typically are NIMBYist and will stop development. And this especially hurts attempts to build more low-income housing and provide more integration of the poor into the wealthier parts of the community. Also impacts education and public health access and everything. On the issue of climate change, climate risk is not really yet priced into real estate. Despite Hurricane Sandy and major hurricanes in Florida, Hurricane Harvey in Texas, real estate prices on coastal properties pretty much went back to normal within a record short period. And so I think there's just generally, we have a lot of ostriches hiding their heads in their sand about what's going to happen. And it's going to happen a lot faster, I think, than many people expect. And finally, and this is the brightest areas on this technology side, within real estate, we have so many companies now involved in what are called fintech and proptech that are dealing with innovations in financing for real estate. I would note the great strides been made in microfinancing in third world countries, and that's having great benefits, and also in proptech, that is property technology, that's really transforming how we do business. In terms of key areas of action, I think there's a worldwide need for infrastructure investment. And despite political agreement in the US, I think on both sides that we need more investment in infrastructure, whether it's bridge repairs and roads to the electrical grid, sustainability, everything, we seem to not be making the investment that we can and should, and that will further stimulate the economy at a time that we desperately need that stimulus. One of the key issues that urbanologists are discussing right now is what's the impact of COVID on the move back to the city. So for the last decade or longer, we've seen, really for the first time since the 1950s, it's popular to live in the city center. Now, this has led to gentrification, but I'm hearing from a lot of people who are finding that they can work from home, who live now in the center city. They're considering moving to the rural areas and ex-urban areas and really getting out of the very places that we've been excited or have been seeing more investment. There is, well, the impact on mass transit from COVID, whether people are going to be more nervous about using mass transit, more people will be using their private cars. So is all this going to have a negative impact on sustainability? One of my personal research areas within Forsyth is we're looking at plan to retreat as a solution to sea level rise and climate change. And this is where one really plans ahead well in advance, building new towns inland and considering movement of entire communities so you maintain the social structure. Then finally, just on the topic of what's the impact of the current pandemic on how we live and work. Certainly, there are drastic impacts on office buildings and the use of office space. I think every owner of office buildings right now is wondering how they're going to pay their mortgage, because they're going to, everybody's expecting enormous, we were already seeing a decline in office usage, and this is really exacerbating it. It's obvious that there are huge changes in how people shop. Everybody's getting used now to ordering online, and this is going to have huge impact on how much retail space we need. We have already talked about commuting patterns as more people work from home. And lastly, there's going to be impact on home design. I'm already seeing this and hearing about it in California, where builders are, well, one thing much everyone's surprised is that home prices have actually been going up in Boston and California, not down. Whether that's a long-term trend remains to be seen. But there's a lot more interest in a home design that accommodates working from home. So office space for both husband and wife, and also just recognition that people are spending a lot more time at home. So I think we are in one of those, as others have observed, just dramatic changes across the board. And I wish I could be a little more optimistic about what the near-term impacts are going to be, but for sure, I think, well, I'm just thrilled to be part of such a broad panel of experts to look at this from all the different perspectives.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for also putting a lens on something that we often sort of take for granted, which is the places we work at, the places we live at, real estate. And it is, in a sense, fascinating because on the one hand, I can confirm since the beginning of COVID-19, 2 property owners that have office space here in New York that the UN rents have approached the UN with reduced deals. I mean, the pressure on the office real estate is almost immediate right now, and it has something to do that others maybe in a broader sense call the future of work. And suddenly the future of work and determinants of what will change have been compressed from a sort of 10 to 20 year strategic horizon discussion into literally 3 to 5 months. And the corollary to that is an interesting trend you describe where people are looking to live. And just to remind us, and since the Human Development Report is trying to look also at how human well-being, human development intersects with planetary realities, it's always been a fascinating phenomenon, and I wonder whether you agree with that, that in the real estate world, people actually vote very clearly for a superior quality of life that is associated with green spaces. You can go to Hyde Park, you can go to Central Park, the Mutaiga Forest in Nairobi, or any other city, and the most expensive real estate will be usually that which is closest to a green space. Just to again demonstrate how closely related sometimes something that some people think is all about environment is actually to the economy of space and place. Before I go to some of the online questions, and to all of those who are following us online, please do send us your questions. Colleagues of mine are quickly processing them and we'll bring some of them back into the discussion. But to the panelists who have been listening patiently and will in a moment come in the second round, any hard questions you want to throw back at what you have heard so far? If you do, please just raise your hand and I'll try and quickly fit in a couple of reactions perhaps. If I don't see any, then either it is all truth or it is not yet at the point of challenging it. But then
so maybe I could challenge Joe a bit.
On you, throw us a curveball.
Not a curveball, much. I'm putting Joe on the spot, which is you gave us all these kind of forks and crossroads, Joe. Any guesses which way we're headed?
I could give you my optimistic take. I think, you know, I'll be very U.S. centric here. What happens in November matters a lot for the United States and a lot for how we think about what may be an alternative vision for the U.S.'s role in the world. You know, when I think about sort of where we are, how we have stepped back from being a leader and dealing with major challenges, it has created a bit of a vacuum. And I think, you know, there is an optimistic view going forward where with a different approach to government, I think you would see both a concerted effort to work with countries around the world on COVID, to think about public health more generally, which has important spillovers when we think about climate change down the road. But, you know, there are many different dimensions in which our two major party candidates are going to differ. But I think how they think about the role of the United States in the world is night and day different. And so what happens in November matters a lot for whether or not we think about a road, taking the road forward as one in which we actually work with our partners, work with our allies. We don't spy our allies. We recognize that some of these tough issues require actually a lot of hard work to try to make some progress. Sometimes it feels like we got to take a step back to make 2 steps forward. I mean, I think back to some of the time I had in government, you know, the climate change negotiations in 2009, some people involved with that are here now. Those are really tough, but I think they set the stage and they help to build stronger relationships with the US and China, for example, with other countries around the world, helping to build and work throughout the UN process to get us to where the Paris Agreement is. And the question is, for a country like the United States, do we actually move forward and say, we're going to rejoin Paris? We're going to actually work with partners around the world on implementing it, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z at home to get serious about it. and to demonstrate that effort about what we can do as we think about economic recovery to make sure it's something that is going to be inclusive and is serious in tackling some of these risks that we share with peoples around the world. So that's sort of the optimistic take going forward. But I think a lot of it has to be a question about how we as a people decide where we want to go forward when we cast our ballot in November.
I know Bill has his hand up.
Joseph, yes, I just saw William, you had your hand up, so a quick comment or question from you, which I saw in the chat, very pertinent.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to come back to the very opening comments from Pedro on the orientation of the next UNDP report. I mean, you guys have stood out since the very beginning of the sustainability period as the ones that insisted, following Amartya Sen's initial guidance to you, that the end goal had to be improvements in human well-being over the long run. And we ought not to confuse that with our changing view of the essential means that had to be pursued to get that done, which obviously include not screwing up the planetary life support systems, but equally not screwing up their governance systems, their health support systems, and so on. And it just seems to me that at a time we're finally beginning to get some purchase on the ends means relationship of people first, but environmental measures and other things to support people equitably, diversely, and so on. It seems to me you guys are taking a giant step backwards and land us right in the middle of the total chaos that is now the Sustainable Development Goals, where we're running in 17 different directions at once. You were the one thing that kept us focused on human well-being. That seems very odd to me.
William, this is already the beginning of a next session that we have to have, because you've now touched on something that we can debate with great passion and intensity. I think we'll leave it to Pedro perhaps in the second segment to also respond, and some of our other panelists, on is it a step back or is it an acknowledgement that managing a systems perspective makes the condition of the planet part of defining the capabilities, just like education and health and income might do. But I simply received the question. I'll leave it in a moment for the panel in a moment to dwell on. But if I could just bring in Michiko. Michiko, would you just tell us perhaps a couple of questions that have come in also from the online chat, or a combination of? Thank you.
Thank you, Achim. We have over 700 people following this conversation on Zoom and YouTube today. The audience is very active in the Q&A function. We're receiving many questions and comments. Let me introduce some of them to you and to the panel members. There are many people thanking and encouraging the panel members, including Maxwell Mazikanga from Southampton, UK. I have 3 questions to the panel members. On sustainability and building back better, how can we as humanity recognize this opportunity and keep the good aspects, for example, virtual collaboration, circular economy modesty, while redefining the new normal on more sustainable principles, since many are simply going back to business as usual? There is another question on gender. Women involvement in decision-making could increase at every level, particularly in crisis situations. How can we ensure that happens? There is a third question on inequality. COVID-19 has really exposed the inequalities in various communities across the globe. How can this be dealt with? Over to you, Achim.
Thank you very much, Michiko. And I think the best I can offer right now is to go perhaps in reverse order and ask each panelist perhaps in a minute to try and pick up 1 or 2 threads that have come up and respond. And then we will soon switch over to our next group of panelists, and all of us will remain obviously engaged. So Richard, may I turn to you quickly and see if there's anything in those questions or comments that you would like to react to? Yeah.
Yes, you catch me before I've had a chance really to look at all the questions. So if you see one that pertains to me, I'm happy to address it. But why don't you move on to the next panelist?
Okay. Now, let me then do Isabel. I think Isabel was in reverse order, the next one. Isabel.
Happy to come on the inequality question. I think we've known that we are an incredibly unequal world today. But it's only through COVID-19 that we have really realized that we're all connected. And the inequality impact in the lives of others has a very clear impact in our lives. I think when we see the problems of the health system, the problems of pre-existing conditions that could have been prevented, I think they all point to the issue of unequal access to health services, for example. So for me, this is the main message of COVID in terms of inequality.
John, thank you very much. Henry, may I turn to you?
Sure. I think the inequality problem is enormous, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think climate actually is going to aggravate it because I think that it's going to disproportionately affect those of the lowest income, both from people, the lowest income countries, but also in terms of the public. If you take a city like Miami, it's the Liberty City. It's the low-income neighborhoods in a city like Miami that are going to get hit by floods. And so I think we really need to think really hard about how to at least make some contribution towards that problem. I think the building back better, I think a lot of that is there's enormous amount of knowledge and of ways to build better. And I think we've got to really think, I know this sounds bureaucratic, of building codes. I know they do in China, we do in the United States, we do in a lot of more emerging countries, but I think we need building codes. It's not hard to do it, and the technology and the know-how is out there. And I think we need to adopt some of these and at least incrementally improve the way we build our buildings.
Thank you very much, Henry. Joseph, over to you. And then I'll come back to you, Richard, yeah?
Thank you. So I think on both building back better and inequality, it's going to be important to think about how we sequence a kind of policy response and thinking about both the actions by the public sector and by private individuals and firms going forward. I mean, there's one thing we've learned from COVID. A lot of our behavior has changed in part because of changes in public policy. Some of it is changes to information we have, but some of it is where people's behavior changed and got ahead of where the governments were, certainly when we see that across the United States. So I think sort of going forward, we're going to have to think really carefully and productively about how we think about our plans moving from what I think right now is addressing a disaster and move from economic policy that's focusing on near-term cash flows for households, for businesses, and thinking about once we have managed COVID, what economic recovery and what rebuilding looks like going forward. And we have some, I think, really important lessons when we go back to the Great Recession, where we saw in the United States and major economies around the world made a significant investment in clean energy and trying to address climate change and their economic stimulus efforts. I think there are some things we can do that do sort of satisfy that sweet spot of being both near-term job creating and an important investment for climate change. And I think we can do those in a way that also help us address some of our concerns about inequality. Those policies are going to be all the more effective at driving investment and addressing, I think, distributional concerns if we couple them with medium-term policies such as pricing carbon, reducing fossil fuel subsidies, where some people have concerns about the progressivity or regressivity of those instruments. How we use those revenues are going to be really important, and we can use those revenues in a way to address inequality. But we can also think about our near-term investments as a part of an economic recovery program that's going to help sort of protect households from, say, a higher energy price world that may occur if we price carbon or eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. If we invest, say, in weatherization and energy efficiency retrofits, or whether we try to expand solar into more of a community's context, where even low-income households can take advantage of that resource. And all that can then set the stage for us to do what we need to do long-term, which is to decarbonize our economies. And so I think it's important for us to think about what the near-term policy for recovery can do that addresses climate change and inequality, that when coupled with medium-term policies will really help drive out those new technologies so that we can then get on that path towards decarbonization.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Richard, back to you.
So responding to one question addressed to me directly on the issue of structural problems, the question is, what could be some of the triggers to build private capital for social benefit? I have to admit, when I was first thinking about that issue, And this is within the context of reading Elizabeth Cohen's wonderful book on Ed Logue, and recalling back in the urban renewal days where there was tremendous public investment. Right now I'm engaged in some research that does point to the fact that China and South Korea have had such a dramatically faster economic growth rate than most other Asian countries lies in the the government's support for building everything. So first, I think there needs to be the federal government needs to take more of a lead than it has in many places that are completely dependent on private capital. That said, on the issue of private capital for social benefit, we are beginning to see more investment funds that do specifically target socially beneficial investments, especially with respect to energy and I think increasingly addressing climate change. That's certainly the theme of what we're trying to teach within our programs at the GSD. But to be candid, the current economic stress is going to probably put more pressure on achieving higher returns among private equity. And I do worry about its impact on social benefit.
Thank you very much, Richard. And to those of you who are not yet initiated, GSD is the Graduate School of Design. I assume that this is more a photograph, or is this the Graduate School of Design behind you? In this case, I think we're all going to enlist next week.
Yes, no, this is my very modest living room at home.
Very good.
And the rest of you will recognize it as the Frank Lloyd Wright room at the MFA in New York City.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask Isabel, you also spotted a question to which to respond, Isabel?
Yes, thank you, Akim. I wanted to address a question on gender because I think it's super central through the crisis as well. We've talked about inequality and we've talked about all of the inequalities that have risen because of the crisis. Well, the same thing is happening to gender balance. And we can just look at, tiny examples. What happens at home when support structures are broken because of the crisis and parents need to take care of their children? Is that care divided equally? Can both parents continue to work at home and take care of this or not? What happens to care for the elderly as well as support structures are affected? I would bet that this is also bringing to the forefront these gender inequalities that we've had for a long time. As we look into finances, for example, we've known for a long time that women have a harder time accessing capital, accessing finance mechanisms. What will happen as there is more competition for resources? Will women entrepreneurs be more directly affected by this? And I would tend to, I hope I'm wrong, but I would tend to think that yes, women entrepreneurs will be more adversely affected by this as well. As we look to what's happening in education, suppose schools open back up, but families have limited resources and cannot send all of their children back to school because they don't have the resources for transport or whatever. Will all of them have the same opportunity, or will boys have a priority in some cases over girls? I mean, everywhere we really need to look at this. On the positive side, I would like to mention the good references that we've had globally to women leadership through the crisis. The mentions to Jacinda Ardern and her decisions not to mention, and I want to bring this here because it's something small, but it's not small. When she said that the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny had permission to move around, what does this mean to children in a time of crisis and in a time of uncertainty? These are small but important things. And just to end, not to gender, to Joseph, all these mentioned to the election, this is not only relevant to the United States, this is relevant to the world. As we speak about collaboration and the importance for multilateralism and the way the US looks at the world will have a great impact on on the rest of the world as well. And I just wanted to share that as well.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for echoing this. And I just want to add one sentence which we are learning every day on the front lines in countries. The ability to also have gender disaggregated data is fundamental to being able to design and target responses. In many countries, most people in the labor market are still employed in developing nations in an informal sector, but actually the majority of those are women. So if you're trying to deal with an economic fallout or free fall from the lockdown, you need to understand how that is impacting also by gender disaggregated data, so that cash transfer schemes and temporary basic incomes that could be set up are actually able to find those people, because they don't exist in the records of government, they don't exist in the record of financial institutions. This is a key part of the work that we're all trying to address as we try to respond to this crisis in terms of leaving no one behind, but also looking at inequality. I just want to ask Pedro 60 seconds to William's point, because I realize that you're not coming back in the discussion necessarily in this session. So a quick, at least, let's say, sign of hope to William that we are not abandoning Amartya Sen's spirit, but in fact, embellishing the future of the report with the intent.
Exactly, Achim, thank you. No, in fact, we're taking a cue from the way in which Amartya Sen engaged in the discussion on sustainability. And basically, his main point is that sustainability is about giving generations in the future, essentially, to make the choices that they see fit. And it's presumption on us to assume that we know what those choices are going to be. And it's a reality that the interactions that we're having with our planet, and it's not one issue, and it's not the environment, I think it's something a little deeper than that, are constraining those choices. And so it's about reflecting the new areas of sustainability science, a lot of interdisciplinary research that joins scientists from the natural science, social scientists, humanities, and see from those insights what messages would be relevant that come also from different perspectives. So for instance, our research seems to suggest that social norms and values are important, market signals are important, prices, but there's a range of instruments that may need to be brought to bear, informed by this new sustainability science that might be relevant to enriching the discussion. So that's the direction in which we want to go, but very much welcome continuation of the discussion with you, William. Thanks.
Thank you, Pedro. And that brings us to a closure of the first segment. And I just offer one thought as we look forward. The ability to respond to crisis is increasingly premised on a more systemic capacity to respond. The interesting phenomenon we're observing in the midst of this COVID pandemic is that whether you're rich or poor as a nation does not determine how well you're able to respond to this. We have seen just in the last few weeks, and Pedro just alluded to it, more research being published that looks beyond just the classic infrastructure and economic indices of readiness and vulnerability. We see developing nations being often more successful because they have either invested in social infrastructure, or as in the case of Kerala, also in digital infrastructure. And the ability to therefore respond to the pandemic is in part defined also by a cohesion factor that exists in countries that allows the role of the state to be played out to its fullest potential, because we do live in a very confusing time. Very often the debate in development is how can we leverage more private finance into the investment, whether it's SDGs now or other public good outcomes. The reality in the midst of the pandemic is that the taxpayer through government is taking a remarkably large public stake in the private sector, to the point where, you know, it will create some debate. The amount of money that is currently being deployed just to rescue airlines by far exceeds the world's willingness to invest in a global humanitarian response plan. And we are literally dealing here with saving well over 100, 200 million lives, but a fraction of the willingness to invest in that compared to saving airlines. And the same is playing out in national economies. Do you save your major company or industry, or do you invest the money in small, medium scale enterprises? And we all know that these are some of the real dilemmas that I think countries are struggling with. And therefore, with great pleasure, I hand over this panel by first of all thanking my dear colleagues from Harvard, for the willingness to engage in this fast-track discussion, but also for laying out some of the forks, choices, considerations that will define what happens next. And the next panel, which is being led and moderated by Luis Felipe Lopez Calva. Over to you, Luis Felipe, and good luck. And I will listen with great interest.
Thank you very much, Achim, and thank you to our colleagues from the Kennedy School. Thank you to Asim and the generosity of all the faculty members who are joining today this conversation. And thank you to the more than 550 people that are actually so engaged in this conversation through their participation online. So the next panel starts as a motivation with the idea of building back better. Even though, as we will see very soon, we will go far beyond that. And we will have Isabel San-Malo, who spent recently time as a fellow at the Kennedy School, but she held a very high level of responsibility in government in Panama as vice president in the previous government, one of the few countries in Latin America that has overcome the middle income trap, yet facing a lot of the structural problems of Latin America in terms of inequality and vulnerabilities. We will have Professor William Clark from the Kennedy School and Professor Gordon Hanson from the Kennedy School, and also Professor Forrest Reinhardt from the Harvard Business School. So let me start by actually introducing very briefly a few ideas and then give the floor to my colleague Kani Vignaraja, who is the Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific at UNDP. And we want to start with a brief introduction that tells you what we're facing on the ground in terms of this notion after this shock, how we actually faced on a day-to-day, day-by-day basis, this idea of how we build better in the sense of establishing foundations for a more inclusive equilibrium after this crisis. This is a shock mainly to the governance systems in our countries. It has shocked the education system, it has shocked the health system, it has shown the weaknesses of the fiscal and social protection systems. So it's really a governance problem in its essence. And it has exacerbated structural problems as the ones that we discussed here. The interaction between people and planet, the inequalities, the vulnerabilities. All these, if there is no decisive and concrete public action, the future will not be as we would like it to be. So based on this notion, Kani, please give us your views on this idea, how UNDP in general and in your particular experience, we are facing this to then move into the conversation with our colleagues.
Sorry, I'm back. Thank you very much for that. And I think I'll draw in also a number of things that I was listening to very carefully in the first segment. But I'm looking, and particularly in Asia Pacific, but globally, looking at what's beyond that immediate recovery phase and what influences our thinking and actions. And I pulled out 5 very short evidence sets, if you wish, that are also conundrums in terms of making these policy choices and how to influence these policy choices. The first is the overall size of the fiscal stimulus packages. And if you look at the comparison between the G7 stimulus packages, where they're spending on average 5 to 6% of GDP, but across the developing world, it is so much less. Now the SG has called for at least 10% or more of global GDP to address COVID. Well, we're nowhere close to that in the South. And we're finding that most developing countries we're working in forego a lot of on-hand fiscal revenue that is spent directly contrary to people's well-being. So reversing a significant portion of these so-called fiscal termites can actually create the fiscal space without resorting to additional borrowing, because that's something certainly we don't want to kick the ball down the road in terms of debt burden. Now, a second set of evidence is then where this money is actually going, the stimulus money. And here we're saying that in the majority of countries in the South, and certainly in Asia, less than 1% of GDP in these planned packages actually pay out to social protection, right? And yet the data is very clear that over 60% of people in this region, and this could be very close to a global average for developing countries, are not covered by any form of social protection. So in recasting that debate on both short-term and long-term practice on social protection, is going for more radical inclusion so out of reach? Or can we really reset this conversation? Now, to play devil's advocate, many of you referred to the cost of fossil fuel subsidies. And in Asia and Pacific, when we did a overall calculation, it amounts to a sizable portion of the cost of what it'll take to actually pay out universal basic income over the next 2 years, covering all those below the poverty line. So, you know, there's these, it's not a cash flow problem in our countries, it's really political choice. Now, to come to the third set of evidence, and Joseph very well referred to this, is a lack of sustained political and policy and investment commitment writ large to address climate change and to protect our natural assets. So we had these few weeks of excitement because we saw blue skies over Paris and Delhi and Kabul and Beijing, and then that's just it, right? And now we're back. We see reversals on even those very short-term wins, and coal and oil firing up industry and transport again. And as Henry said, I think people will die of suffocation and toxic air. Isabel also spoke to disruptions in the food supply chains, right? So we really want to bet on innovation and behavior change, but also pricing carbon right, and a bolder reset on some of those political commitments and policy choices if we're going to make a breakthrough here. For us, the fourth set of evidence is around jobs. The bad news is that getting gutted in both the formal and informal sector. In India alone, now it's up to 450 million workers from the informal sector who are out of a job. That's the latest ILO stats. And they were also saying that 1 out of 5 SMEs in the developing world will just shut down permanently, but that's where our jobs are. So the fact that it's not just about lives and livelihoods, but here it's interesting that, you know, and this comes to Joseph's point on policy sequencing. Here, governments are looking at providing support to SMEs, getting a lot of these young people back to work, not because they care that much about these young people, and not even maybe that it's about an economic issue, but it's a political imperative. This is going to lead to conflict and instability. And with a lot of elections coming up, this is a voter base, and certainly in the region that I serve, it's a very active voter group. Now, the good news on jobs is that on average, we're seeing that more jobs, 4 to 5 times more jobs, are actually being created in renewables than invested in fossil fuel industries. And China is a leader in this area. So really, again, betting on renewables as also the job creating sectors is going to align maybe the climate agenda with the economic agenda. And the last set of evidence I wanted to point to, which Pedro started with also, was how exacerbated the digital divide has gotten. And what we're seeing is that one of the biggest breaks, which is in the education chain, will be the hardest to return to and to recover from. So it exacerbates inequalities and injustice. And what this has elevated for us, which it hadn't in the Amartya Sen world, was that affordable access to the internet is now a must-have public good. So I think all of these 5 areas change the social contract between government and citizens and private sector if we're going to move forward. So I hope we don't stand at these forks in the road for too long, but really push forward to make good choices. Back to you, Luis Felipe.
Thank you very much, Kani. And I think the idea that we want to find this balance between people and planet in the context of this crisis and the discussion within the logic of the new Human Development Report, the idea is really about establishing systemic change. And that involves new rules in certain, in many important aspects. And even as we will discuss later, issues related to changes in relative prices and getting the prices right, I would say, because at the end we will live in a world of decentralized decisions. But as I said, this is a crisis of governance. So I would like to start with Isabel Saint-Malo and to ask her, how is these an issue of governance, and how do you see these through a lens of the governance crisis and you know, conflict was mentioned by Kani and potential instability? Isabel.
Thank you, Luis Felipe, and I definitely agree that the whole crisis in development that is happening as a result of the sanitary crisis and the economic crisis, we need to look at it through the governance lens. And to have some framework, I would like to take us back to 2019, before we even had COVID here. Before we had COVID, we had governance tensions around the world. When we look at the world map, we can just name the several cities around the world that had protests and had citizens on the streets: Algeria, Chile, France, Hong Kong, in 2020 itself, the United States. In different places, the triggers for the protests are different, but at the end is the same underlying issue, is that people's expectations are not being met. People are frustrated and people are expressing that frustration through these protests. Now, when we look at what do they ask for, again, it varies from country to country, but demonstrators battle corruption, demonstrators battle poor economies, they claim political autonomy, they claim freedom. As we discuss how to build back better and which choices of public policy will lead us to a more equitable and a more inclusive world, we cannot lose sight of those weakened institutions that were there before and that are there now, which are the institutions that will allow us or not to build back better. At the end, institutions and the way the state responds to citizens and the way the state has the capacity or not to listen to citizens is central. And I'm an eternal optimist, so I would say that it's not something that cannot have an answer. It's not going to have an easy answer, but we've solved situations like this around the world before through dialogue, through conversation, through consensus building. We need to listen more to people to understand better what their situations are. As we see contempt rising in political discussions around the world, we have also seen that when people give a minute to sit down and listen to each other, they understand better where the others are coming from and they validate better those expectations. So if we can put back governance at the center of the developing issues that we need to work at to ensure that all of the other development questions are responded, I think that's very important. Kani has mentioned some issues that are central to a new social contract, and I believe we can go down a list, but how to address them needs the coming together of state, of citizens, private sector, and in the developing world mostly, but I guess all over, more and more citizens are getting this idea of the state having endless resources to solve my problems. And we need to shift this conversation to a conversation where we understand that we all need to be a part of the solution, that we need to bring societies around a common objective, and then around what are each of us going to give to arrive at that common objective. It's a question of collaboration. It's a question of understanding that my well-being depends on others' well-beings, and that I need to contribute to that as much as I need to contribute to mine. And if we're able to have that at the center of the conversation as well, I am optimist into what we can have in the future in terms of governance, and then of course in terms of development objectives. They do not stand alone in the world in a void, development objectives. They stand amidst institutions, and they stand as well amidst privilege and amidst pressures to have a particular set of groups be benefited. And that plays against other objectives. So I would say that we need to bring that back to the conversation.
Thank you. Well, Professor Clark, you have studied for a long time the interaction between science and public policy, and you lead a discipline called the science of sustainability. And many people say, actually, that should be the focus in the Building Back Better. Growth should be a means, but never an end anymore. And actually, sustainability is the issue now. And governments are making decisions under a lot of uncertainty. So what do you think we have learned from this crisis in terms of this logic of moving towards sustainability in an uncertain world?
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. I think what we should have learned is we should be more humble about what we know. But let me give a little fuller explanation to that. First, I want to start by the notion that the idea framing today's discussion that we somehow ought to be identifying the game changers, what's special about the current overlapping crises, that if we just figured out what that was, we'd know what to do, is, I think, the wrong question. A better question, I think, emerges from putting the crises of today in a longer term perspective, which, at least for those of us working on sustainable development, is necessary and natural. We're looking at intergenerational affairs. From that perspective, we know that catastrophic disruptions, often of even greater magnitude than those facing us immediately today, are the norm, not the exception to human history. These catastrophic disruptions commonly kill millions of people within a generation, devastate the well-being of the people who survive, strip away the sheets under which empowered members of societies have been only too glad to hide prevailing social ills, injustices, and inequities. These happen all the time. What differs from disruption to disruption is not so much the immediate damage or game changes that they bring about, but rather how society and its leaders choose to respond to the gaps and opportunities that those that are left in the body counts and the economic and social devastation of those answers. So I think the key choice before us is, rather than the key game change that is somehow happening independent of our choices, is whether we're going to commit ourselves to dismantling the extreme, and I mean extreme, power asymmetries that are increasingly strongly putting and holding in place the economic and political arrangements that lead to intensifying planetary degradation, increasing inequities in the well-being and vulnerability of people around the world, and so on. Let's not fool ourselves. These aren't just a mistake we made. These are things that many people and groups have an interest in maintaining. And if we're going to change things substantially with our choices of what to do in the wake of these crises, it's going to be by confronting those directly. Now, fortunately, you asked me to do two much more modest questions on which I actually know something. So on those, briefly, you asked, what's the choice for scientists trying to benefit the public interest with their work rather than simply pursue blue sky knowledge, which is a great thing to do. And there, I think research tells us that for science to be influential, it has to be produced by scientists choosing to spend time in dialogue with the users in society that might be expected to act on that knowledge. Dialoguing, talking with them, listening to them, not just talking at them. That dialogue needs to be conducted in ways that the advice scientists offer is perceived by the potential users, whether they're average citizens or heads of state, to be salient to the user's concerns, credible to them, and crucially respectful to their fears and experience, however different those may be from those of the scientists themselves. Perversely, in this time of COVID, public health scientists have been way out at the forefront of experimenting with and actually practicing drills in how to do that kind of dialogue-based influential knowledge in times of crisis. A few of them remembered that in the heat of COVID. Most of them forgot, and we have ended up with vastly less influence of science than we ought to have had. Almost certainly the lesson we ought to be relearning from the COVID experience, its few successes and its many shortfalls of science, is that we need to frame science advice for public policy in terms of risk, of helping people, decision makers, citizens, understand the best we can, faced with uncertainty, how what they do will change the risks that they and others face, and convey to them the limitations of our own knowledge, frankly and humbly. We really have not done well on that in this crisis, or in the background climate crisis behind it. Last and easier, you asked me about choices about governing innovation. There, I think it's fairly straightforward. Research tells us the need for innovation in public goods, whether the internet and vaccines just raised, renewable energy storage devices, and so on. Public goods innovation has never been more needed. And at least relative to any other time in my professional lifetime, the amount of resource going to public good innovation as opposed to private good innovation has never been worse. The private sector is increasingly soaking up the people and the money that could be invested in this stuff, and the resulting knowledge is privatized in ways that more often than not enhance inequalities and damages rather than mitigate them. We need to invest heavily in the power rearrangements, the institutional reforms that enable radical increases in investment in public good production and in the governance of the social property rights to the knowledge that emerges from our collective enterprise. I think that's what research and experience have to teach us here.
Thank you very much. Very clear, very focused and comprehensive. Let me go to Gordon Hanson. Gordon, you have studied for a long time the movement of goods, capital, and ideas through your work in economic geography. There is, as people respond to the crisis, there are behavioral responses that are of concern. One of them, because of the vulnerability that it implies, is migration. So people are, there is return migration. There are many elements related to migration that are, the patterns are changing due to the crisis. And that is of particular concern from a development perspective. So what can you tell us in terms of how the crisis has affected, and what are the options for the future in terms of migration patterns?
Thanks very much, Luis Felipe. Good to see you. Good to see the other panelists, and thanks for including me in this great program. So let's just go back a few months before the crisis and think about what would be our major thoughts about international migration. The primary one is that it was too small. UN data show that only 3.3% of the world's population lives in a country other than that of their birth. And with enormous differences in productivity and wages between countries, we have unrealized opportunities for income gains that are simply massive. Not only that, but with the rise of ethno-nationalism and populism globally, we were seeing strong political currents against increasing the flows of labor globally. So what has COVID done? COVID has added a quite substantial tax to global labor flows that manifests itself in different ways. One is to increase the risk of mobility between countries. And this is simply because travel makes you more exposed to the virus, and travel also creates an opportunity for the virus to travel from one country to another. Research we're doing at the center for international development right now is trying to understand the extent to which the presence of these migration flows between countries created a mechanism for the virus to move from places like New York or Madrid to countries of origin for migrants who are now residing somewhere else. A second dimension of this tax is that it now creates a new type of exposure on the part of sending countries to changes in destination countries for migrants. And that is, remittances are a major source of GDP for a number of countries and a number of small countries in particular. We've always known that remittances were cyclical because many migrants work in industries like construction or manufacturing, which tend to be pro-cyclical. There's a certain volatility there that comes with the territory. We did not anticipate the extent to which an incident like COVID would dramatically compress remittances and create serious adverse shocks to GDPs in countries that have come to rely heavily on global labor flows. Those shocks come the magnitude of those shocks owe themselves to a couple different reasons. One is that migrant workers tend to concentrate in occupations that are particularly sensitive to job loss resulting from COVID. And two, we're talking about populations that are economically vulnerable to begin with. And so when we have losses in income, one of the first things that's going to go is a reduction in savings, and remittances in many senses are a form of intra-family savings. So that's one dimension of this COVID tax, is raising the cost to moving labor from one country to another, either in terms of where people live or the back and forth flows that come from international migration. There's a second dimension of that tax, which we're just beginning to appreciate, and this hits us all in the university world quite acutely. That is, we think about the global innovation ecosystem. It relies heavily on global labor flows, starting with students who go abroad to get their education. They use the opportunity of being students in other countries to get in the queue for temporary work visas. Those temporary work visas then put you in the queue to obtaining a permanent residence visa. Many of the workers who predominate in the US tech industry got to the US through that tripartite process of student, H-1B worker, and then green card holder. What COVID does is disrupt each dimension of those flows. Today, we face the incredible reality that we can't get visas for many of our foreign students because the US State Department has pulled consular staff out of its offices worldwide. You need that consular staff for interviews. We just can't, our students can't get here. There now is going to be a heightened perception of risk of studying in countries where COVID is intense. And what we saw this week is the Trump administration taking advantage of the current environment to restrict immigration for the rest of the year, targeting in particular temporary workers, where those temporary workers are crucial because it's the intervening step. It's how you go from being a student to being a permanent worker. And when you remove that intervening step, you in effect empty the queue and severely complicate the process of maintaining those labor flows. For the United States, what this means is that we're in the process of blowing up our model for innovation. What the rest of the world means is that we're blowing up the model for the creation and then movement of those ideas between countries. There's hope that we might be able to create a model that looks better, that involves knowledge creation that is more democratically created. But in the current political environment, all bets are off in terms of which direction we're going to go. To echo something that Joe Aldi said, here again is where what happens in November really, really matters.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I encourage all the participants to submit their questions through the Q&A space. And then to close this first round, Professor Reinhardt, in a way your research brings a lot of these issues together by looking at institutions and public policy, corporate behavior, when it relates to public goods and externalities. So in a way, we're talking about how also the crisis redistributes potentially power, capacity to influence. And one of the main issues like repricing the economy and creating the right incentives for businesses to behave in a more sustainable manner in terms of social and environmental objectives, maybe is there, the opportunity might be there. What is your view in terms of these crisis and how it pertains to the private action with respect to this balance between people and planet?
Thank you very much for this very distinguished group. I was thinking about corporate social am I still muted? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, we can hear you.
Yeah, there's something the matter with my computer, as usual. So you think about why firms would voluntarily produce public goods. It seems to me, just to take a step back to set the stage, there are three possible sets of reasons. One is that they think that by doing so, they'll enjoy some advantage in some marketplace, right? Like maybe they can identify consumers who are willing to pay them more for their product because they are doing the right thing by the environment. And you can think of examples of that. It's harder to think of examples of that in the mass market than it is in the firms that sell to the upper tail of the income distribution, but nevertheless. A second, maybe more pervasive reason is that firms think that by providing public goods or doing the right thing or behaving responsibly, they can differentiate themselves in the labor markets against their competitors, particularly with respect to young people who may be very interested in working for firms whose expressed values mirror their own. A third common market-based thing that you hear is about the capital markets, that somehow firms that behave socially in a socially responsible manner, somehow defined, can have an advantage in raising capital. I'm a little bit more skeptical of that. I think that the marginal investor looks at returns and that money is fungible, and that the capital markets tend to follow what's happening in the labor markets and the product markets rather than the other way around. But that's one sort of set of things. Like maybe firms just see it as another form of competitive advantage. A second possible set of reasons is that the executives' own ethics motivate them to behave in particular ways. And that may very well be important, and there's enough agency in the relationship between the shareholder principals and the executives that they can indulge those tendencies if they want to, many of them. But you can see that that's a very frail and unsustainable basis on which to place a corporate social responsibility policy, because it depends on the preferences of the individual executives. And a third possibility is, well, maybe they're up to a bigger game. Maybe they're trying to change the rules of the game. They're trying to influence the behavior of governments. And lots of people think that that's a very exciting and empowering idea, because if you get the business community lobbying for the right kinds of rules, then it'll be easier for the governments to do them. We can start pricing natural resources in more efficient ways and so on. But when firms are intervening in the political process, they are normally intervening in that process in pursuit of their shareholders' interests, at least in the Anglo-American world. And so that, again, you might regard with some suspicion if your hope is that the firms are going to produce some kind of substitute for the government institutions that have not been doing the job that we hoped they would do. So you look around, you read their press releases, firms are doing all kinds of wonderful things. They're reducing CO2 emissions, they're saving water, they're building schools, they're planting trees, and yet it adds up to a tiny fraction of what our scientific colleagues tell us is necessary to create a more just and environmentally stable world. What firms can do is show what's possible. Maybe they can help shape consumer preferences. They tend to be pretty good at that. Maybe they can shape regulation, although you have to be careful about that, as I said. But if we think of corporate social responsibility and corporate unilateralism as a substitute for government institutions that reflect the preferences of their constituents, then we're dooming ourselves to disappointment, I would say. If I could just say one other thing, we've been talking quite a bit about the this fork in the road between a more progressive direction and a sort of snapback to the bad old days. To mirror something that that several of my Kennedy School colleagues have pointed out, because they're much gloomier than us business school people. A third possibility is that that institutions are actually going to get worse under the stresses that we're creating, right? And if you look at the way my government, for example, I'm American, has behaved in response to COVID, it's done all the things that you wouldn't want it to do. It's raised barriers to imports, it's foregone gains from trade, it's made immigration more difficult, it's facilitated rent-seeking behavior by people it likes, it's facilitated disinvestment. And so if you think about our collective response to the next crisis, which will occur, it seems like it's imperative to try to strengthen those institutions so that the next time they will behave more in keeping with the long-term interests of the broader populace rather than the short-term interests of the people they regard as their constituents. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is very helpful for the conversation. I think now we are ready to go to specific questions from the audience. So I'll give the floor to Michiko to tell us how the dynamics will go.
Thank you, Luis Felipe. The questions are still coming in from the audience. We've received many on the topics of multilateralism, SDGs, and COVID-19 impact in the Latin America region specifically. Let me introduce some of them to the panelists. On COVID recovery in the Latin America region, Roxana Goldstein from Argentina asked the panelists about the regional, in particular in the Latin America region, aspect of the COVID crisis and recovery roles. We need transboundary coordination both for managing the crisis, which is still not controlled, and the recovery post-COVID-19. Question on SDGs. Adarim Namakanova from Kazakhstan asks, how can we persuade governments in the age of COVID-19, especially in developing countries, to continue targeting SDGs, specifically SDG 13, which is on climate action? Question on multilateralism. This is posted by Arun Sadio from India. The pandemic has exposed the fault lines in multilateralism and international cooperation, as most of the UN member states are trying to fend for themselves, and in the process, the low and middle income countries are finding it hard to cope up. What could be the policy solutions and reform agenda? If I may, there's an extra, one more question on happiness, metrics, and well-being. What do the panelists think about moving away from metrics such as GDP or HDI to measure development and move towards gross national happiness, as in Bhutan, or other similar metrics as game changers in the Building Back Better era? Thank you. Over to you, Luis Felipe.
Thank you, Michiko. In a way, the question on SDG is the one on intergovernmental coordination and multilateralism point out to the same issue of the role of multilateralism actually in the solution of the crisis. And for this, if I may invite also Isabel Guerrero and Isabel San-Malo and I invite Isabel Guerrero because of her distinguished career at the World Bank as well. What would be her views on this issue of the role of multilateralism in this crisis? And after that, I'll go to Isabel San-Malo.
Oh, what a difficult question. So I think it has to do with governance. I'm just thinking of the World Bank, which I know well. I feel that a lot of the constraints to being fit for purpose for this new world have to do with the governance structure of the World Bank in this case, and having a more inclusive governance structure that actually represents the world of today, not only in terms of countries, but also that is represented not just by ministers of finance, but a much more inclusive idea of who is in that governance structure. So that is my answer on multilateralism for the World Bank. Every organization has their own governance structure, but these are such huge problems that I think they need to look at the governance before anything else.
Thank you, Isabel. Isabel San-Malo, would like to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Luis Felipe. And I would like to address a question on Latin America, if you allow me.
Yes, please.
Like to mention that we can find the types of response of every kind within Latin American governments. We have several countries that have been very responsible and have recognized the crisis and have taken steps on lockdowns and economic measures. And we have others that still today are saying that the pandemic is not real and that they don't have an issue and they're putting no systems in place. And that's really a problem. Of course, a problem exacerbated with the issue of migrants through the region. But also on Latin America, it's important to put an eye on what the Human Development Report has already mentioned regarding the numbers of different countries to face the pandemic in terms of doctors per number of inhabitants, bed hospitals per number of inhabitants. So the deficit that we already knew we had in Latin America in terms of health infrastructure, for example, is becoming an issue right now as we are still in the heightened point of the crisis. And lastly, I would like to refer to the very difficult situation, which has already been mentioned by some of the scholars regarding the world in general, but that's an issue definitely in Latin America, and is the issue of fiscal space, that some countries are not going to have the fiscal space to take the measures that they need to take. In addition to that, in Latin America, we have some countries with a situation of their debt right now who are trying to renegotiate debt, and that aggravates their fiscal situation, and we need to look out to that in terms of what the economic forecast will be. So I would say that as the rest of the developing world, Latin America is as well in a complicated situation to face this crisis.
Thank you, Isabel. There is a question on the change in the metrics, the space in which we measure social advancement. And I think that is a question that Pedro Condizao could address, given the work in the report. Pedro.
Thank you, Luis Felipe. No, I would encourage all of us to think of metrics as a set, as opposed to trying to define an optimal indicator. The concept of human development is quite broadly linked to this notion of capabilities. And so the Human Development Index is an index of capabilities actually biased towards basic capabilities. And so we opened the discussion in the report last year about exploring, incorporating new capabilities. As Kani mentioned, access to the internet today is something that is becoming more and more essential. And in fact, Amartya Sen wrote about this. He said, you cannot think about the relevant set of capabilities that were important for India at the time of independence compared to those that matter today. And he actually referred to the internet as an example. So the HDI is an index of capability, but it's not the only index that we produce in our report. We have indices that look at gender. We have the inequality adjusted Human Development Index. So I think it's important to look at a range of metrics, each of which tell us something that is relevant for the policy or analytical issue that we're interested in. And we are engaging quite a lot with the innovations that are happening in the field that I would broadly define as well-being, in which there are different ways of trying to assess and measure well-being more directly than through indirect means. Sometimes some are based on subjective measures of self-reported happiness, for instance. There's the composite way of the Growth National Happiness Index of Bhutan. So all of these are relevant and should be interpreted and used in the appropriate context. And the effort that we're doing with the report this year is to add to the universe or set of metrics that will speak to some of the issues that we're going to put forward in this relationship of how people interact with the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. I would leave it now open for any of the participants who would like to participate on the questions raised, or just to intervene on any of the issues that were discussed in this panel. Yeah, please, Professor Reinhardt.
Thank you. I'd like to make a modest suggestion about the indicators. We're obsessive about GDP. We talk about 3 significant digits of changes year to year. If we did that in the business community, if someone comes to you in the business community and says, look at my beautiful income statement, the first question, it takes you 2 seconds to formulate it, is, well, let's see the balance sheet. But we don't do this at the national level because we think it's too difficult and you can't value human capital and this and that. But to have a better understanding of what's actually sustainable and what's not, it seems imperative to look at the balance sheets. And I hope that we can make some progress in that in the next decades. We know how to do it. The World Bank has been doing it for decades. We just don't seem to pay much attention to it.
Thank you. Professor Clark, it seems that you want to participate. Yes, please.
Picking up on just the same thing, I think on this notion of a balance sheet and of multiple metrics used to guide different things we're doing. I mean, nobody's going to argue in the midst of a COVID pandemic that we should not have metrics about changing rates of saturation of hospitals and the like. We need those to manage the immediate situation. For the longer term strategic situation, I think one can couple this argument about well-being and the question that was posted up on the list on the SDGs. Now come back around. I think scholars and practitioners over the last 10 years have made substantial advances in metrics that work for the long-term notion of sustainable development. Okay? It's not the only metric we should be using, but from the Stiglitz-Sen report, from the work of Dasgupta of the UN Environment Program, and more recently of the World Bank, these notions of comprehensive wealth or inclusive wealth that argue that sustainability means handing down a bundle of resources: human capital, natural capital, social capital, manufactured capital, a bundle of resources that is at least as capable of generating well-being for its generation or its place as the one we inherited from our kids. And that's been operationalized by very systematic work at the bank through UNU and UNEP and other scholars in ways that it is actually providing now. Not complete guidance, no more than the GNPs were complete in 1953, but ones that are beginning to provide practical reads on whether countries are headed towards sustainability or away. And I think the crucial part of that is they are focused on the goal of long-term, equitably distributed well-being. The reason that's important is that it avoids the disaster raised by the person who questioned, how can you urge a country to keep in mind SDG 17 on climate when it's being buried under COVID? The answer to that is, if your ultimate goal is well-being over the long run, and we're not going to have a fight about climate change versus COVID versus poverty alleviation, we're going to keep our eyes focused on well-being, which these metrics are now doing, the potential to achieve well-being. And we're then going to recognize that in order to achieve that, you have to do some things about climate change and some things about pandemic preparedness and some things about job creation and up and down the list. So I think we're actually further ahead than we often allow in providing these, and they're being done now not just at the national level. There's some firms using these metrics. There are certainly states and sub-regions, subnational regions using them. Let's build on that stuff rather than pretending that it doesn't exist.
Thank you very much. There are 4 people with their hand raised. So I will ask you to be very disciplined, and I will give 30 seconds to each of you so we can close the panel. So we have first Gordon, Kani, Isabel Guerrero, and Asim. So Gordon.
So very quickly on this issue of multilateralism, we have a new challenge, and that is to regulate global trade in viruses, which is more active and more important than we thought. And we need to recognize the externalities that health systems in one country impose on health systems in other countries.
Thank you. Very clear, Gordon. Kani.
Yeah, I am responding to a few questions that talk about how do you kind of get over the hump, how who's going to kind of get ahead. And I just want to point to three where we're seeing countries or communities or institutions pushing ahead of others. One is those who are investing now in low carbon pathways on production and transport in particular. The second is those who are trying to reduce the cost of injustice and conflict. So really, looking at some of that peace payout, but also in particularly closing the gender gap. The dividend of that is so high, and we're seeing it expand. And countries that are pushing, and communities doing this even at a local level, we're seeing that payoff. And the third is these new coalitions, and in some ways they're old coalitions, which was co-creating between government and private sector, right? I mean, on basic scientific research, for example, like William talked to, and also on education. And these bringing back some of that co-creating coalitions, I think we're seeing those countries and institutions moving ahead as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kani. Isabel Guerrero?
My question is I mean, for all of us, do we really need to focus so much on growth and on increasing consumption per capita in the way that we've been in the past? That is, for me, the question that COVID has posed. Do we really need this manic focus on consumption?
Thank you very much. Asim?
Yeah, just two comments. One on this multilateralism. I think we should also not get too enamored by this as well. A lot of countries that I've been working with and seeing, the issue is within country politics, which are very salient, often between the federal level and the provincial levels in terms of views on lockdown, not lockdown, the extent of lockdown. So I think the role of multilaterals should be more to kind of share global knowledge and best practices, but there's a whole bunch of political dynamics which are playing out within these countries, which are affecting policies, and often at the cost of delaying action. You know, at the end of the day, delay is extremely costly, whether you decide to open or close. As long as you're measuring and acting, that's important. And so I wanted to kind of at least mention that. And the second thing I wanted to mention is an earlier comment on gender. While I agree with the concerns kind of Isabel expressed in terms of the inequalities COVID will create, I also think there is actually huge opportunities on the gender dimension. In a lot of countries, the exclusion women face is because of physical space. I think the fact that we're now embracing virtual space is going to create a lot of opportunities that women, if we play it well, can actually exercise and engage in a way that they weren't able to before. So I'm looking towards that sort of virtual inclusion as a way, particularly in conservative societies where women's mobility, both occupationally but physically, is limited, can actually be a real game changer.
Thank you very much. It has been a super interesting and rich conversation. It has been a privilege for me to be part of this. Let me give back the floor to Isabel Salmaló for our closing. You are muted, Isabel.
Thank you. Thanks once again to all of the Harvard scholars that have joined us in this conversation. The UNDP team. Has been a very, very rich conversation which touched on human development, on inclusion, on environment, on multilateralism. I think this just proves the way that Asim mentioned at the beginning, and so did Akim, that this can be the first of many, many conversations. And I would also like to thank the many followers that we've had for this conversation. We began the conversation with 650, a little over that, and ended with 400 and something. So that just shows that these are issues that people care about and that people are interested about. And I think that is also something very important to note. So once again, just thanks so much. And let me give the floor back to Asim and Akim for the closing remarks.
Akim, you want to go ahead first?
Asim, you're first. I began, so now the privilege.
That's good. I'll turn over my 1 minute to Adriana, who's kind of been leading a lot of the work with me at CID. So Adri, maybe you can give our closing remarks. I'm just thrilled. Thank you for this conversation. I'll turn it over to Adri and then Akeem can close.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Asim. Just to conclude and not take more time of everyone that's engaged, we just want to thank everyone. Thanks the panelists and UNDP for the opportunity to be part of this discussion, this very timely discussion. We know that a lot of advancements have been done in the last few decades in terms of human development, but there are still a lot of challenges, and COVID has now presented us with both new challenges and tensions, but also with new opportunities to reassess where we want to go. And so we're excited about the possibility to collaborate much more in the future with UNDP, with our faculty colleagues, and with other colleagues on many other issues and dimensions of human development that were not necessarily covered today, as this is such a huge area of work. And we also hope to engage with the audience and our students in taking this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asim, Adriana, and also to Isabel for having brought us together. Just a small remark in terms of something that William said, which strikes me as very important. Humility is critical, because in looking at what is playing out before our own eyes in our own personal context, but also for those of us who have the privilege to have an ability to look at what's happening across the world, this clearly is a dramatic and traumatic moment. But in humility, one should never, I think, be tempted by also then sitting back, remaining silent, and not also assume responsibility. I think what we try to explore today is the responsibility to bring different faculties, different understandings of what is happening together from an academic research perspective, from a practice perspective, and address something that collectively can either paralyze us or even divide us, or bring us together and accelerate the kind of responses that I think most people across the world right now are looking for. Leadership doesn't always start at the top. You know, we often sort of blame leaders and ask them to do the impossible. I think we live in an age where informed citizens are as key and as vital to driving leadership and wise and informed decisions as an elected or appointed official. And in that spirit, this discourse this afternoon was both inspiring, and I think it points to the kind of world that we would like to be shaped by these kinds of discussions. So thank you very much, Asim, to all the faculty members in Harvard, to my colleagues, and to the many who joined us. This is a conversation that we will pick up again, and we have at least 10 topics that we got out of today's different articulations that we will pick up. But I also end with one appeal to all of you, which is that, you know, in the discussions about globalism and nationalism and multilateralism, isms are a form of abstraction. I think the harsh truth is right now, we need local and community power as much as we need an ability of nations to work together. We live in an age where the notion of nationalism is simply not a rational response. It may be an emotive, it may be a reflex response, but whether you're looking at pandemics or cybercrime or climate change, the notion that we somehow enter into a period where we walk away from working together as nation states and therefore as the peoples of the world is just inconceivable. And yet the risk that we may head in that direction is a very real one. That's why this sort of discussion matters. Thank you so much, colleagues. It's been a privilege to be with you, and looking forward to the next one. Isabel.
Thank you, everybody, and until next time, thanks so much for your time.